Okay. Any other announcements? Okay. Well, then I'm very happy to introduce our speaker, Dr. Benjamin Crain. He says, don't be formal. He can be Benny. Who has who lives and breathes orchids, basically. He's been involved with orchids since before he did his PhD, which was on the conservation of some tiny orchids in Palau, a group of them there. And he's been involved with this, the Orchid Specialist Group of the IUCN, the North American part of that, which is looking out for rare orchids. And I'm sure we'll be hearing about that from him, as well as everything you wanted to know about orchid biology. He's going to show us orchid seeds. Okay, Ben, you can take over.
Great. Thank you. Okay. All right. So this is a little bit new format for me, so I will do my best.
Okay.
Just want to see if, okay, yeah, there we go. Okay. And there's a little volume. If you guys are comfortable with it, but I actually don't mind if you put on a little light so I can see you guys. That's fine with me, but okay. So let's yeah. Well, I'll get started anyways. You guys can figure out the lights. That's fine. That's perfect. That's fine. Yeah. Can you guys see the slides okay? That's the most important part. Okay. So yes, I'm Benjamin Crain. As she mentioned, I work with the Smithsonian, a group called North American Orchid Conservation Center, which is actually a consortium of botanical gardens, university partners, really worldwide, primarily focusing on North America, but we're breaking that mold. And I'm also the co-chair of the IUCN Orchid Specialist Group in terms of the in situ conservation group. So we basically focus on the ground orchid conservation. But again, those are partners from Taiwan to Central Europe to South America. We've worked with people all around. We have a pretty nice, robust group. We're just reinvigorating it now. Hopefully, in the next orchid conference, which will be in 2026, you'll hear more about that. But today, what I want to focus on is orchids of California, and specifically a little bit about orchids in Humboldt County. So yeah, away we go. Oh, but I can't use this button, so I got to use this button. How do I scroll? There we go. All right. This is delicate. So first and foremost, why care about orchids? She mentioned I'm an orchidophile for life. What is it about these things that is so intriguing to me? I think that says enough, but I'll continue. There we go. So number one, I'm being generous. This is the world's second largest plant family on Earth that flip-flops back and forth with the aster people who we have deep hatred towards. That's not true, but actually a friend of mine is an aster person. She passed away, but you know, she kind of took us over the lump to beat us. But this estimate of 25,000 species is probably more towards 28,000 species at this point. They're coming out pretty regularly, so I think we are number one. But what that tells me is that they're really important in terms of plant diversity. There's estimates that say basically 10% of all plants on Earth are orchids as in terms of species. So I mean, that's a huge number given the number of families. And that also tells me that they're representative of biodiversity as a whole. I mean, if we're talking about 10% of all of our plants, you know, I mean, that's a huge component for biodiversity, which is critical. Secondly, they're distributed almost everywhere on Earth. The exception literally is Antarctica. There are even satellite islands that are in the Antarctic Circle that have orchids. So pretty much you can experience them anywhere you go, which is really cool. But more so, they're very fitting for spatial studies and across different scales. So we can test biogeographical theories like island biogeography, species area curves, really in different scales, different regions, look at the ecology behind them and why that might play out. So they're really fruitful for those types of things. In addition, they exhibit really complex lifestyles. So if you have an interest in orchid, can pretty much satisfy it. Some of them are terrestrial, like we'll see here. the vast majority are epiphytes. This is a really cool example, Teniophilum from Palau. This is the flower here, but if you notice here, this is the entire plant. It's just bare roots. It's lost all its leaves and it does all of its photosynthesis just in this little tuft of roots. So strange, right? I mean, just weird. A lot of them have things like pollinator specificity. They're really lock and key matched with a single pollinator. Things that are extreme, like mycoheterotrophy. This is an example of a coral rhizome, which we'll talk a little bit about in not too long, but no photosynthesis whatsoever. They're entirely reliant upon a mycorrhizal fungi to support them. So again, what this tells me overall is that they're really well suited for ecological studies. We can really learn a lot about ecological systems between pairings of plant, animal, and fungi that might be representative of bigger theories, bigger picture things. But if you're looking at something, you can pretty much find it in an orchid. Now, importantly, because of those unique interactions and all those details, orchids are very sensitive and they're very indicative of disturbances, things like climate change, things like poaching, fires. Here we see livestock grazing in Europe. It's basically just munching on orchid fruit right there. This is an example of illegal harvest or over harvest at the very least of orchid tubers. Very common in parts of Africa and the Middle East. They use it to make ice cream, the famous Turkish ice cream, salep, a bread called chikanda, which is very famous in parts of Africa, and it's becoming rarer and rarer and rarer. And people are starting to notice that these traditional harvests and things like that are having an effect. Well, what that tells me is that these things are very suitable, as canaries in the coal mine. When we start to see orchid declines and orchid disturbance, it can be very foretelling of potentially larger impacts that we're about to experience really before they come into fruition. So valuable in that sense for saying, hey, it's time to look at this stuff if the orchids are reacting. Now, because of that sensitivity and that specialization, obviously what we find in our IUCN group is that many are rare, threatened, endangered, and declining. So this graphic here just shows the cumulative percentage of orchids that meet one of our threat categories in the IUCN group. We basically measure them and define how threatened or rare they might be. And what you'll notice here is that, it started out at 80–90%. It's declined in recent years, but that's because we've been much more active. The important part of this graphic is that once we started getting more active, you can still see it's hovering around 50%. So basically half of every orchid we assess meets some of these threatened, rarity, endangerment categories. So that's not a good thing. That's a lot higher than almost everything else. So it's been a steady trend that's just become more and more concerning. So it's declined a little bit, but when half of everything is rare, that's not good. So I hope at this point you guys can appreciate why orchids are cool, why I'm concerned about them. And the next obvious question might be, well, great, we're interested. These things are rare, they're declining. What the heck are these things anyways? Everything you see here is an orchid from this minuscule Lepanthes, which is the group I studied in the Caribbean. Or Xanthera, if I'm not mistaken. I always forget the name of this. Completely subterranean, bucket orchids, Coryanthes. Everything you see here is an orchid, okay? So how do we get to 28,000 species in one family? Well, there are 7 things that characterize orchids. I'm going to highlight this little plus or minus here because much like everything in ecology and biology, it's never always true. So I'm going to go through them. First thing, zygomorphic. The flowers are zygomorphic. For those of you who aren't familiar with that term, basically it means they can be divided in one way. They can't be divided like a pizza. There's a single bilateral symmetry. What you're looking at on the right hand of your screen is basically a tulip, and you can see female parts, male parts, nice little swirl around them. When you go over to an orchid flower, this is basically the division. Okay, and what part of that is the stamens is up here. It's on one side. Okay, we'll talk about this lip below, but you can see it's bilateral. And the reason I bring that up is not only because it's a fact, but ecologists and evolutionary biologists have realized that simple switch has been very critical in the evolution of orchids in terms of pollination mechanisms and things of that nature. So just that little flip, which other flowers do have, has been critical for diversifying the orchids. The second thing is what's called the column. And that is what is a fusion of the pistil and the stamen, which you would see in standard flowers. So these diagrams here are pretty intricate drawings from Bob Dressler. He unfortunately passed away not too long ago as well. He's the orchid, the man. But basically it's a fusion of these two parts. Normally you have male parts, female parts, but here we see a diagram of a column. You basically have this stalk, and this is basically your stigma here. Okay, so your pistil is this. The anther is up at the top here. It's on a lot of times a removable part. You can see it extended. If you look at it from the side again, this would basically be your pistil, and here's your anther curling over the top there. So again, that fusion is a critical feature of the orchids, and it comes into pollination and things of that nature. But that's a very distinguishing feature of the column. Oops, little buttons don't work. If we look at some real life pictures of it, here you can see it quite clearly. Here's that bilateral symmetry, this is the petal, and here's your column fused together, anther on the top, all in one organism. When you see it in cross section here, you can kind of get the feeling of, you know, the traditional parts. So you basically have your pistil with your ovary, your style, and your stigma up here. But if you notice in the back, you kind of have your anther, and they're all connected in that single thing. And that's the column. So very important in terms of identifying an orchid. There are other families that have something similar, but this is an orchid thing. Okay, we're going to try and get technologically advanced here. So number 3, the seeds are very, very, very tiny. Compared to all other plants, these things are minuscule. This is some of the variety of seeds you see here. But what you notice is these little dots in the middle. That's the embryo. And then what's called the testa, which is this little network of basically dermal cells that surround it. Let's see a close up here. This is a single orchid seed. Here's the embryo, and here's the testa surrounding it. That's a fruit encapsulator, and you can see how small these seeds are. What I like to point out about this is that I call orchids the world's worst parents. This embryo, as you can see, has done nothing for its offspring. There is no nutritional value in these things. It's just an embryo and a basket. Off you go. Why that's critical and how that works is this, that it's not very expensive to make these things, and there are tens of thousands in a single fruit. And I brought one. I want to pass this out. You guys can take this and look around. This little yellow dust in here, this is the fruit of one single orchid that we grew, and that little dust is the seeds. And you can just see, there's somebody to count. If you can count those, I'll give you $1 million. We'll be here till next month. But the advantage of that is that it is very easy to produce. And if I can make this work, this is a little video that I want to show everybody. This is the advantage. Let's see if it works. Play. Oh, we're glitching. Look at that. Oh, we don't have it. Oh, how do you guys not have it? I can see it, but you guys can't see it. Well, the video is really cool. I'll show it to you guys later. Yeah, maybe at the end.
Share screen again.
New share. How do I get out of this now?
Zoom can see the video.
Technology. How do I? Oh, I'll just close that. Wow, that's weird. I can't share it with you guys.
Play it again. We could see
try
it.
one. Let me see if I can just do it like this.
It's over behind you.
Oh, well, I'll show it to you guys next time. Okay.
Maybe afterwards for the Zoom turned on.
Yeah. Okay, we're back to where I'm at. That's fine. Oop. Anyways, the point of that video is you can just literally tap on one of those fruits and you can just see these things wisping off into the wind, almost like pollen. I mean, it just, they go. So the advantage is distribution. You invest nothing, you send 10 million babies out, and hey, good luck, right? World's worst parents on the planet. Okay. That's good, though. I'll skip this other video, which is a bummer. That's a cool video. The next thing, number
Benjamin?
4, the
Hey,
flower has all
Benjamin, Zoom
this
can't
back
see
to that
your,
bilateral symmetry thing. And what a labellum, also known as a lip, is basically a very uniquely modified single petal. These are monocots, so the whorls are in three sepals, 3 petals. But if you notice in these drawings, for example, there's one big one here, one big one here. This is commonly referred to as the lip. Almost all orchids have something that's highly modified.
Benjamin, can
Here
you
are some
hear
really
me?
cool examples of it. This is Bifrenaria from down in southern South America. Obviously, if you're a pollinator, that's extremely attractive. You guys have probably heard of the bee orchids. This is Ophrys aviifera, the famous bee orchid, common name. Guess what it's pollinated by? This is the lip. I mean, very attractive here. The bucket orchids, Corianthes here. This entire thing is designed to help with pollination.
We're not seeing this screen for some reason.
Oh, in the Zoom? Sorry, let me go back because maybe I screwed up that one. There we go. Do they got it now?
Not yet.
Yeah.
It's still the pollen coming out of the pod.
Sure. Let me know if they're catching up. Corianthes anyways, bucket orchids. This whole thing is a modified lip. This is a single petal here, this entire thing. And then one of my personal favorites is bulbophyllum. This is bulbophyllum echinolabium. That's the lip right there. And it's actually this swivel hinge thing. And what it does is it attracts flies. It stinks like rotten meat. They will climb up that thing.
It's
And when
still
they
that
hit
pollen
the-
video, the video that the
It
audience
will
can-
actually flip over, like if you walked across a teeter-totter, and all of a sudden you go, and it basically, boom, plows the fly into the pollinia. All right, let's try again. Where are we at? Zoom, screen sharing. I'm not a Zoom person. New share. Does that one work for him?
Does that work?
Yes.
Yes.
There we go. Okay. That's the
Thank you.
labellum for them. You'll read about it later. Anyways, the whole point is the lip is highly modified. It can do a lot of stuff related to pollination. Very cool. And that's part of what defines an orchid. Next, resupination. This is a very kind of weird word in some ways, but this is a great picture. Flower twists. This is not, again, a unique orchid thing, but in ecology, nothing's true. Almost all orchids have this. Not all.
The Phalaenopsis is the video.
Yes,
I didn't notice that.
yes. So when you get a nice close-up, look at that ovary down below,
Okay.
and it's twisted, okay? Not like chubby checkers, it's actually morphological. So this is kind of, a little bit of a detailed graph, but if you look at the top here, this is the axis. So that's basically our stem. That's our inflorescence, right? And this lab, that's short for labellum. It's the lip, what we were just talking about, those real ornate features. But if you look at a developing inflorescence, the lip, if this is my stem, the lip is actually emerging here next to the stem. And as the bud develops, it comes out and eventually it twists and it ends up at the bottom. Okay. So that's kind of how it develops. And they've done recent studies on this, and they think it actually is partially just gravity. Basically, the unique, ornate, robust size of them can actually just eventually turn it down. There's more to it than that, but largely it's just a matter of overall development. And I think these images really show it very well. This is a bud coming out from this orchid here. If you look here, here's our axis. This is the development of the bud. This is a spur. This comes out from the back of the flower below the lip. And this is where the spur is emerging. So you can see some early ones here. It's kind of backwards, but this one's the best one because, again, it's pointed towards the stem. Now, if you go to time frame 2, where's that spur? It's right on the bottom, right next to this lip here. So it starts out right up here, and then it twists as you can see these twists and it ends up at the bottom. So that's resupination, and that's a big feature that the orchids, it's useful for identifying them. Now, as I mentioned, nothing is true. So these are two examples. This is Prostechia. You can commonly see this in the trade. This is the grass pink, Calopogon tuberosa, southeast USA, eastern USA, but they almost look upside down. But in reality, these are the flowers of orchids that are not upside down. The lip is actually on top of both of these things. So in the orchid world, when you see that, it's like, wait, it's backwards. And actually, it's not. Everything else is backwards. These are the oddballs that are not backwards. Number 6, the rostellum. And I'm really bummed because I have a cool video to show you guys about the rostellum, but I'm not going to monkey around with it at this point. The rostellum is very interesting. It's a graphic of it. Let's focus on these two. And literally all it is this little appendage here. And this little appendage here. And what it is it's actually part. Again, remember, orchids are monocots. They have whorls of 3. And so the stigma actually has 3 lobes. You kind of see them here. Well, one of those lobes has evolved to create this little appendage that sticks out. Why is that? Well, there's any infinite number of reasons, but the big thing, the initial thing that makes sense is that here is our anther and our pollen. Here's our stigma. We don't want to self-pollinate all the time. So this little appendage blocks the anther from the stigma from the same flower. And there's a lot of mechanisms associated with that. And again, I would show you this awesome video. Some of these things, I'll explain it, have evolved so much that they have a hair trigger that when you touch the rostellum, this little hair in the catasetum, it actually ejects the pollinia with this sticky packet, and you can launch them. I mean, we've actually had little games where you can send them flying, but if a bee comes onto that, it goes in, touches that hair, boom, it slaps a pollen packet on its back, scares the heck out of it, and off it goes. So it does not want anything to do with that same flowers in terms of pollination. So that rostellum is a very little intricate devil. And you can see here in some of the drawings, here's the rostellum here, here's the pollen packets locked in there. I mean, when you get into all this stuff, there are so many mechanisms involved with that. The big thing is a basidium, which is a sticky packet that has evolved from this little tissue thing. You know, you get into it here, and will actually, again, it's like glue to send the pollinator on its way. So that's a big thing in orchids, is the presence of, or the function of the rostellum and its existence. Here are some live drawings of it. Again, you can see here's the stigma. This whole thing is the column. Here's our stigma. Here's our anther on the top. And you can just see this clear appendage right here. That's the rostellum. Here's another example. Here's our stigma. Here's our rostellum. Here's our pollen. So very hard for an insect to just switch between the two. Now, as I was saying, in terms of pollination, how it's worked, again, underside of our pollen, here's our stigma. Here's our rostellum. Here's our pollen. This is after the pollinators come and remove it. See that piece missing? That's that piece of the rostellum right here that's now stuck on a bee's back and saying, get out of here and take this somewhere else. And your pollen are gone. So it's a new take on the sticky stigma because it's pretty intricate in many ways. No, once it's gone, that's off. Gone, gone, gone. And again, as you saw with the seeds, if I showed you pictures of rostellum, hundreds and hundreds and thousands of different mechanisms on how that works. The trigger video, if anyone wants to see, is my favorite. I actually submitted it as a Smithsonian video randomly. It was why you like studying what you do. And I was like, this is a cool pollination thing. And it won like 10 million views. People were like crazy about it. And I'm like, okay, I just poked a pollinator, but all right. Okay, number 7, pollen. They're formed in masses. Again, you can see that little rostellum piece down here, but basically, you know, pollen, it blows around, right? Well, the orchids have worked to converge all of that stuff into these little balls that are called pollinia. The whole mechanism is called a pollinarium that includes, you know, pollen, the rostellum pieces, the basidium, all that kind of stuff. But what they do, again, as I mentioned, it's a very distinct delivery mechanism. So you can see here, this is not a guy with hoop balls on his hat. This is pollinia stuck to the face of that pollinator. Here's a hawk moth. All these are pollinia that have been pulled off these flowers that are stuck under this proboscis. So it's not just blown into the wind like they're seeds. They've almost kind of reversed it. It's like, well, we're going to take care of our pollen, but who cares about the seeds? Different strategy, but it works. Now, 7 things that make an orchid an orchid. Number 8. I don't know why this always gets left out, but a thing people don't know about orchids is, as I mentioned, world's worst parents. I wasn't kidding. What does that mean? Their seeds will never germinate without a mycorrhizal partner. Every orchid needs a specific mycorrhizal partner. Some are more open to multiple partners, but if you take seeds, people will buy seeds on the internet and I put them in orchid bark, it never grows, nothing happens. No, will never work. Without a mycorrhizal associate, they will never germinate. So that's just a uniform thing about orchids. I'm sure there's an exception you've never found. So when a seed lands, it has no nutrient, it can't photosynthesize, it's laying on a piece of bark, it's laying in the soil. It needs a fungal associate to penetrate that testa, at which point the embryo will start taking nutrients from that mycorrhizal fungi, and it'll start growing enough until it can produce chlorophyll and start photosynthesizing on itself. Okay. In the meantime, as it's developing, that fungus will be around in its environment, and eventually it will penetrate as the orchid matures. It'll penetrate the roots and it'll merge into these cortical cell spaces and form what are called pelotons. And they're just these little balls, these hyphal coils that it locks up in its cell. And when the root needs nutrients, it simply digests it and eats it. In the meantime, it can live everywhere else. And actually, there's studies on I forget the term right at the moment, stable isotope studies, where they've shown that actually in certain stages, the photosynthetic carbohydrates will get shared a little bit with the fungus. So the fungus is gaining a little bit by living there. But in the meantime, the orchid's basically just robbing it of nutrients that it's decomposing. But without that, no orchids. All right, so you guys are with me? Orchids are cool. You know what an orchid is? Are you ready for the quiz? I'm not going to do that. Okay, so they share 7 plus or minus features with exceptions. But you probably have all seen this, right? I mean, everybody's seen this at the grocery store. So what makes 28,000 species with these 7 different things? What makes them all different? Like, how does that play out? How do we get to the craziest, biggest family on earth? So I'd like to shift now and talk about orchid diversity, and then we'll get into the California orchids. There's a lot of differentiation even within them. So overall, a lot of taxonomy doesn't really play in this field, but we divide in orchids. So we've got orchid family, we've got 5 subfamilies, we've got tribes, we've got subtribes, genera, subgenera. We like to compartmentalize, and then it's because there's just so many, it's hard to get a truly accurate phylogeny. But overall, there are 5 subfamilies, 25,000 species, more like 28 overall. I'll point you to the top here, the Apostasioideae. That's the basal orchid. This is the sister clade of all other orchids. Only 2 genera, 16 species. These guys are weird. They're in Southeast Asia. If you saw one, you probably wouldn't think it's an orchid. And that makes sense because this is the nascent start of all these weird features that we talk about. Next, sister to that, we have the Vanillioideae. This is the vanillas. You've probably heard of those. But 15 genera, 180 species. They're found in the subtropics as well as the tropics. Vanilla planifolia, Mexico. We do have vanilla in Florida. Not something you'd want to eat. But again, not that common. This was recently described. This has been a problematic group for a long time. And I think it was just 2015, maybe 10 years ago, where Ken Cameron at University of Wisconsin finally said, you know, I've got the molecular stuff. This is its own subfamily. They were weirdly misplaced. There were different subfamilies. Moving up next, the Cypripedioideae. 5 genera, 130 species, widespread. We'll talk about these. You guys are probably familiar with a bunch of these. The big players are the Epidendroideae. 500 genera, 20,000 species. The vast majority of orchids are these things. If you're in the tropics, you're probably looking at something in this subfamily. Not entirely certainly, but 20K. I mean, it's 75% of all of them. And then last we have the Orchidoideae. 208 genera, 3,500 plus or minus species. Again, these are widespread. They're found all around North, South America, etc. California. Moving on to California. We obviously miss out on a lot of the oddballs, but we have the three primary players in the orchid world. We are familiar with three subfamilies. We have 37 species in California. I was talking with you, that bothers me. That really bothers me. Why are we the most plant diverse community in all of North America? We have all this weird stuff. And in the most diverse plant family in the world, we've got 37 species. People are, well, you need habitat differentiation. Yeah, we got that. You need different climates. Yeah, we got that. Well, most don't like dry weather. Well, I mean, we got that. So I'm throwing that out to everybody as a hypothetical question. If you can figure that one out, I'd love to hear your theory on why we don't have more here. Moving on to Humboldt. We again have three subfamilies, but we've got 25 species here in Humboldt. So we've got basically 3/4, 2/3, whatever you want to call it, of all the orchids in California are found in Humboldt. So we're sitting in the hot spot of Orchidaceae in California, which is pretty cool. I like that. That makes me much happier. All right, so let's go through these things. I'm just going to go through the subfamilies and we'll get into the different species. I'll go through this kind of quick, and if I'm getting way long, somebody please remind me. I'll speed up, but this is the Apostasioides. Key features here. Note, non-resuppinate. You can kind of see them. They don't have that twisty look to them. They also don't have a really differentiated labellum. Okay, the key feature is they have 3 stamens. 2 are fertile and surround the column. 1 is completely infertile and non-existent. But again, that kind of makes sense. This is the basal orchid. This is the development ancestrally of what orchids came to be. So pretty simple herbaceous plants, kind of weird, but kind of more normal than your normal orchids. We don't have them, so on we go. Okay, Vanilloideae. Again, I just, what describes these things? I tried to read up on it and re-bolster my knowledge of them. I can't figure it out for the life of me. It's, you know, succulent herbaceous or succulent vines that are up in the canopy to little herbaceous things in Southeast US. They really, I can't find any morphological feature that's in common. They've got everything. What they have collectively is genes. So genetically, they're related. Again, the vanilla you eat is the same thing as you find in a bog in North Carolina. You know, and again, like I said, this just came out in like 2015. So it has confused the heck out of biologists, particularly those focusing on morphology for years. It just didn't make sense. And it still doesn't really make sense, but genes make sense. So there you go. That's rose begonia. We even have that in DC. I love that one. So yeah, okay, so moving on. So let's get to the stuff we've got. Cypripedioides, okay? Humboldt, we've got 3 species. Now, Cypripedioides, the distinguishing feature there is the slippers, okay? Paphiopedilum down here, mostly Southeast Asia, India, that kind of area. Look at that labellum, just like a pouch. This is Phragmopedium. Almost looks identical. Obviously, this is a crazy species, but again, that pouch labellum there. Okay, those are South America, Central America, neotropical. Selenopedium, another little group, nice little slipper pouch. That's from Panama to South America into Brazil. This one is one of my personal favorites. This is Mexipedium. Anybody know where Mexipedium's from? Tibet? No, Mexico. Yeah, it's monotypic. There's one species. I forget the species name. Actually, it's Mexipedium xerophyllum, I think. But basically, it loves these dry, loving, gravelly areas in southern Mexico. So it's kind of weird in orchids. It's not that humid, loving thing. But again, look at that nice slipper pouch there. And then here, Cypripedium. That might look familiar to some of you guys because that is the Cypripedium. That's the slipper group that we have here.
Yeah.
We have in the US. Europe has a few of these, but obviously the slipper's there. So, let's get into the Humboldt species a little bit, and I'll go through this taxonomically so you can kind of see some of the relationships. This is Cypripedium californicum. It's not endemic to California, but pretty close. It gets up into a little bit into Oregon. I'm not sure if it extends into Nevada or not, but I think no, I think it's in California. But again, this beautiful slipper, it's sweetly fragrant. It's pollinated by carpenter bees. I actually saw this recently. You can go up into the Horse Mountain area and find populations of these. If it's a bright sunny day, man, it is gorgeously fragrant. And I'll tell you, the bees are just crazy. I found a new hatred for deer after revisiting these sites, munched down to the nub. But beautiful, beautiful stuff. But yeah, this is one of our, more endemic type things. I'm told, however, it's quite common here by another friend of mine who's an orchid expert. I don't agree with him, but there you go. Our next Cypripedium fasciculatum. Does anybody know fascicle? Basically bundle. It means bundle. Right there. Apical bundles of these slipper orchids. It has a wider distribution, higher elevation generally, a little more montane. Most orchids are found in like boggy or streamside areas. But again, higher elevation, cooler streamside things. Coniferous forests are a good place to find these things. What's really interesting about these guys, you can see how it's kind of like that purple brown. Well, supposedly it's pollinated by wasps that are looking to lay eggs and larvae that will eventually parasitize fungus gnat larvae. And so supposedly it smells like fungus gnat larvae. I've never found that candle at Walmart, but so I don't know what it smells like, to be perfectly honest, but hence, the dark color, it's you don't want to go sniffing that one. I would assume it's not sweet like the other one, but cool plant. And then we get to our third Cypripedium montanum. Again, very showy. You can see this beautiful lip here, that slipper-like lip, the coiled sepals, herbaceous. It's a little bit more widespread. It can get over into Wyoming and Colorado, I believe, up into Canada. Again, pollinated by a variety of small bees, quite fragrant, but higher elevation. So I have not seen this personally here yet in Humboldt. I expect if you get farther in, that's where it will be. Okay, so that was Cypripedioides. Now let's get into the epidendrons, epidendroides, if you will. Okay, so really diverse subfamily. Most of these things are tropical. Remember, I said, 20,000 species. So you've got just about everything here. This is a classic epidendrum here. Notice non-resupinate. These are what are called reed stem epidendrons. They're real tall and almost kind of woody. The vandas, completely epiphytic. If you put these things in even bark, they die, they rot. They just want to be this giant root tangle from Southeast Asia. Really beautiful showy flowers. This is related to the group I studied. You can see the hand here, miniature little things, the pleurothalids. Lepanthes is one of the largest genera in the orchid family, with close to like 1,500 individual species in its own right. Again, bulbophyllum, another miniature Southeast Asia, related to that real weird swivel lip. Same thing. This is bulbophyllum monoloforme. It basically just has pseudobulbs, and this is the leaf, this little nibble right there. But these things are probably about that big. The whole plant could fit on a quarter. And then here's a great example of a Nervilia, a group I've been working with. Little herbaceous terrestrial, one leaf, little tuber, leaf comes up. This is actually an oddball because the flower's there with the leaf. Usually it's a leaf, gone, you come back later and there's a flower. I hate these things because I've been looking for them half my life, and I can find 100,000 leaves and I never get a flower. But yeah, they're beautiful. So again, very diverse, mostly tropical, but not all, including the ones we have. Now, what unifies these things? I don't want to get too technical here, but they have what are called incumbent anthers. That means they're bent. So remember, we talked about the column. So we've got our female parts, our stigma, and we've got our anther sitting there. Well, in this case, it bends. It's just that simple. And so if you look at these drawings here, here's our sticky stigma, here's our anther bending over. Same thing here, bending over. You can get here, just a little curl on the top here. These are examples of not bending. See, it's just like direct off the top. Here's actually cross sections of the flower in development. You can see here, earlier stage, it's up, and then as it matures, it bends. Same thing here. This is an earlier stage, it's already bent, but when the anther and the pollinia are fully developed, it's just recurved over there. So that is one of the, it's the big unifying feature of this subfamily. And we've got quite a few of them here. And I'll point out that there's a few different tribes. Again, I mentioned we divide things. So within the Epidendroideae, there are different tribes as we move farther down, but I'll go through these. The first one here, Calypso bulbosa, the fairy orchid. You guys might have seen these. If you look at the distribution map, this is one of the more widespread orchids on the planet. It's completely circumboreal, quite common here in Humboldt County. Beautiful flowers. It's pollinated by bees. It's sweetly fragrant, but it offers no reward. So it's a classic orchid cheater. It's like, hey, love me. I got nothing to offer. Another annoying thing about these guys, as beautiful as they are, I just learned recently how ephemeral they are. They come up, I went back to collect fruit. I think it was 3 weeks later after I saw the flowers in full bloom. I couldn't even find the leaves. And this was like in an open area where I was like, I literally stood next to this tree and there was a dozen of them gone. So early bloomer, get out and see them because they're gone, but beautiful showy things when you see them. There's subpopulations that are pure white as well. Okay, also in the same tribe, strangely enough, we get into the coral rhizas. This is Coral rhiza maculata, the spotted coral root. Beautiful flowers. Key feature here is these spots on the white lip there. Again, like most orchids, sparsely distributed. They can have a pretty wide range all the way into Canada, Mexico, all across the West. But where you find them is, you know, you get lucky when you see them. The big thing about these guys, as I mentioned before, complete mycoheterotrophs. They have no basic pigments for fertilizer or for photosynthesis. So they're completely reliant on mycorrhizal fungi. No leaves. They basically come up just like you see. It's a flower spike. They hope for pollination and they're gone. And they're a tuber until you see them again. Very cool little plants, very goofy. We have another one, Coral rhiza mertensiana. Key feature here is this serrated lip. Obviously the coloration is a little bit different, but if you see that serrated margin on the lip, this is what you're looking at. Much narrower range. This is the Pacific coral root, and as you might imagine, up the Pacific coast, it gets in a little bit to Montana, but these brilliant purple flowers, but again, complete mycoheterotrophy. All you'll see is the flowers and they're gone until next year. Pollination, very underexplored in these things, usually coniferous forests. And then we get into our third coral rhiza here, striata stripes. This thing looks like a candy cane. When you see it, you really can't confuse it with any of the other ones. What's interesting to me is that you look at the range again, all the way up into Canada, east and west, down into Mexico. But when you look at records for Humboldt County, very sporadic. The only time I have seen this, and I have looked and looked and looked, was when I pulled over in Bull Creek one time. I went for a hike and I literally pulled on one of those turnouts, opened my car door and stepped out and was like, wow, that looks like a coral rhiza on the edge of the road. Never seen one since. I've gone back to that spot hoping, you know, I hate to say it, you just kind of got to get lucky or be really persistent, because once you miss it, it's next year, you know, so you can't go back next week. It's, you know, but these stripes, key feature on those guys. And again, wasp pollinated, but not a lot of studies on these things. It'd be cool, but difficult to get through those. Okay, so moving on to a different tribe within the same Epidendroideae family, the Neoideae. This is what's called the phantom orchid, Cephalanthera. You can guess why it's the phantom orchid and why it's related to coral rhiza. What do you see here? This is your whole plant. There is absolutely no leaves. There's no green pigment whatsoever. It's called the phantom orchid because it's just this white thing that pops up. They've just recently found new populations of this. I remember found one in Napa. Again, it's pretty limited in overall range. One thing I find very fascinating is this is the only Cephalanthera in North America. I've seen these in Europe in Darwin's property, Charles Darwin's house. This is one of the things that he studied, and you can see these Cephalantheras out in Downbank abundantly. I mean, they're not weeds, but they're everywhere. So it's weird that we just have this one here. But again, grows in open, mid-open, shaded kind of wooded areas. Again, usually near streams. sweat bees are the pollinators, but very ephemeral. Once it's up, that's it. No leaves, no leftover plant to find next year. Moving on, the stream orchid, Epipactis gigantica. This is one that we have around here that's supposedly quite common. Again, I've had difficulties finding this locally, but they are around. Again, stream orchid found near stream habitats. They're quite large. They can be quite robust, beautiful orange, red, yellow flowers down to Mexico, up into Canada here, water loving, beautiful flowers. The interesting thing about these guys is that supposedly this callus here, this part of the lip, mimics a cluster of aphids attacking it. And so the pollinators, which are syrphid flies, flower flies, will lay eggs for their babies to eat the aphids and feast on the aphids, but there's no aphids there. So apparently this has an aphid smell to it. So, and the callus kind of looks like it. But yeah, really cool orchid here. And then we move on to the Neotias. Now I want to point out that a lot of these, if you find local guides, will list this as Listeras. That name is gone. So Neotia, so don't get confused by the manuals. It has changed. But these guys, look at this beauty, this giant, magnificent thing that's probably about that tall. These are tiny little devils. The key feature here is the moss. If you see little moss mats like that, that's where you're going to want to look for these guys. They're very little herbaceous guys. Strangely enough, a key feature of these fellas is that the leaves are more than halfway up the stem. They just have these two paired leaves, your inflorescence, and so you'll have stem, leaf, or leaves, and then a little bit of the inflorescence there. For me, the dead giveaway is a kind of a blind guy is these real dark patches right here at the base of the lip. When you see that, you're looking at Banksiana. And again, it's a Western distributed thing. You can get out to Montana, but it is local here. And you can see this at places like Big Lagoon. You can see it up above Clam Beach. Anywhere that you get that mossy Sitka spruce habitat, you might be able to find these guys if you're careful. But it takes an eye. Related species here. This is another Neotia, Convalarioides. Again, it's got these two paired leaves, but they're lower on the overall stem. Very small plants. You can see these are higher elevation, they're more inland. I'm told like up in Neeland, you can find sites for these things and off 36. Key feature here, yellow-green flowers, but look at that little notch in the lip there. When you see that little notch, that's kind of a differentiation between the previous species. Obviously, those dark green markings are absent, but I always love to joke about these things. To me, it looks like a bird flying in for a landing with really giant front feet. And if you notice, all the rest other than the lip are kind of fanned back like it's blowing in the wind. That's just my imagination because again, they're about yay big. So, but really cool too. Also, notice that rear disjunct distribution. But you look at where they're at: Newfoundland, Maine, the Great Lakes up in northern Wisconsin, and then out here. So I'm thinking spruce moose country, real mossy, a lot of pines, you know, that kind of thing. It makes sense, but any disjunct is always confusing. It's like, well, how did it get from one to the other without crossing in between? Oop, okay. And then the last one here in the epidendrons, Neotia. This is Neotia cordata. This one's actually another one of those famous ones. This is all the way out into Russia, Japan, all across North America, Greenland. You can find this thing just about anywhere. There's weird populations of it in a number of places. Has these two small leaves, cordate meaning heart-shaped. It does have heart-shaped leaves. I think they all kind of look a little bit heart-shaped, so I don't really use that one as a differentiating thing. But again, sporadic around here. You can find it in most places. But this is the big thing. It's a huge bifurcation in the lip. If you see those two extended things, I think it looks like a human. Head, little arms. You see that you're looking at cordata. But again, you're talking something smaller than your pinky nail. You know, I mean, this is half the size of your pinky nail for these flowers. One of the cool things on this, back to what we talked about with that Visidium, it actually has little trigger hairs in this area the rostellum. And when they're stimulated, they start to secrete a glue-like gland, a glue-like substance. Pollinia stick to that glue on your pollinator, and it also causes the rostellum to start to wither. So it kind of blocks the stigma until it's stimulated, and then it starts to shrivel up. And then once the pollinator leaves, now the stigma is exposed, doesn't waste time with the anther anymore. So really intricate stuff in these things, like all orchids. I mean, there's cool stuff in all of them. All right, moving on. Our last subfamily, the Orchidoideae. This is our biggest one. In Humboldt County, we have 13 species. Again, cut me off if I'm going too long because some of these are a little tricky, but this is our biggest thing. But they're also some of our, maybe our showiest ones. Now, so the Orchidoideae, mostly terrestrial orchids. Again, this is Rhizanthella from Australia, completely subterranean. This is an orchid. The duck orchids, again, Australia. Here again, this is another Darwin orchid. This is Ophrys insectivora, related to the bee orchid. Looks like another insect, but it's basically, again, back to that pollinator specificity. Doesn't look like that bumblebee. This one attracts wasps, so it just targets a different species. That thing grows in the same habitats. Again, here's a Bipinula, one of those South American guys with this crazy lip here, attracting pollinators. And our jewel orchids are also in these terrestrial orchids, one of which we have here. This is Macotes from Southeast Asia, but we'll see, we've got one of these here. But again, mostly terrestrial. These are not primarily tropical things. And as I mentioned before, a big feature of these is these erect anthers. So remember, we had our recumbent anthers that are bent over at the apex of the column here. Here's our stigma. In this case, we have our stigma here, and they're basically straight out. And they develop differently. You can see there's an attachment point here, there's an attachment point at the top. That relates to pollination and which insects are actually attracted to it. But you can see it here. Here's our little rostellum. Here's our anther, our pollen are here, and our stigma. But that little feature, that erect development, is what distinguishes this subfamily. So one you guys might be familiar with, the Cranacheidae tribe. First one is Goodyeria oblongifolia. There's a few species of Goodyeria across North America. Again, a really cool disjunct, but you see it back in my hometown up in the Northeast. Out here, this is probably one of our more common orchids, rattlesnake plantain. A cool thing about this guy, it can be in shaded habitats, woody habitats, but it's pollinated by bumblebees. And what's fun is that the inflorescence is very tall. The bottom flowers mature first. So a bumblebee will start foraging and find something on the bottom and work its way up, and then they're immature and it can't really get in there. So again, it takes pollen and leaves. If it were to keep moving up and getting rewards or thinking it's getting rewards, it increases self-pollination. So things mature at the bottom and then off it goes and it moves its way on out. But you can find this on the dunes. You can find this in most of the coniferous forests around here. Humboldt Botanical Gardens has these. Just keep your eyes open. The foliage is really more impressive than the flowers in this case. The next one is the Spiranthes. This is Spiranthes porifloria. This is Western ladies' tresses. Any Spiranthes that you're looking at, the key thing that you'll first see is the spiral kind of arrangement of the flowers. It looks like they're corkscrewed. In this case, they're more yellowish. You can see that yellow thing going on here. There's gradients and compared to pale white, but this one's limited more to the west. Again, found near streams, wet meadows, that kind of thing. Yeah, really cool thing. They don't know much about the pollination, but this one is more limited. And I bring that up because this is Spiranthes romanzophiana. I've seen this on the north slope of Alaska. It has, again, a very wide range all the way. Strangely, it gets into like England and Ireland, but the rest is North America. Here seems very sparse according to our maps, but again, you can see this out at the dunes. We've seen this up near Ruth Lake along the lakeshore. It can be quite common, but again, that spiral arrangement, in this case, whiter flowers. This one is interesting. It has another pollination mechanism that's really cool. But basically, the visidium and the rostellum covers the anther, and when it's pulled off, it removes it, and then the stigma is exposed. So that little piece that we saw before in that photo that's taken away kind of blocks the stigma. And once it's gone with the pollen, then it's wide open for another visitor to come in. So widespread, but again, you can see this one here. It's a really cool plant, and it has these big underground tubers as well that are quite cool if you see them. Okay, this is where I thank you guys for allowing me to learn a little bit, because We're going to get into the Platantheras. This is going to be the last group of our presentation, but the Platantheras are a nightmare. They have been called Habanarias, they have been called Pipurias, they have been called Platantheras, and back and forth and back and forth. They're all pretty small. They have distinct differences that, unless you have good eyesight and a hand lens, can be really frustrating. A lot of them overlap. So we'll go through these guys. This is the bog candle. These are probably the tallest Platantheras you'll see around here. The key feature here, if you look at this little fella on the lip, see how it's tapered and then it widens at the base? That's a key feature for that guy. So if you see that lip that spreads out like that, it's probably one of these. But again, very tall. They're called bog candles because they just look like big stalks in the bog. Again, usually aquatic loving to some degree. Pretty wide ranging, as you can see. Kind of sparse here. I've seen these up towards Horse Mountain. I believe that these might be at the dunes. I think there's a little confusion out at the dunes on what's what. I think these might be out there, not 100. I haven't seen them yet, but I think they might be. And it has kind of a spicy fragrance, but pollination syndromes have commonly been kind of rebuffed a little bit. But this is moth pollination, classic moth pollination. It's bright white. It can attract things at night. Okay, this one I know is at the dunes. This is our next Platanthera. This is Platanthera elegans. The wood rain orchid has pretty dense inflorescences. The key again for me on these is these green stripes. I tend to see those quite regularly. There can be variability, but if you see a plant that has the lateral petals and the dorsal sepal with these central green stripes and a dense inflorescence, that's elegans. And again, mostly on the West Coast, you get into the mountain areas. These actually surprisingly tend to be in a little bit drier conditions. But in parts of the dunes, you know, it's pretty sandy and it's pretty exposed, so I could see how that could happen. Formerly Pipuria. This is one that you'll look up in the guidebook and they'll separate it from Platanthera, but Pipuria is no longer in existence. At least, not currently. Next is the dense flowered rain orchid, the Platanthera elongata. Maybe you can see where this one got this name. So again, similar range. This is why a lot of these are very confusing, very much in terms of overlap. Coastal scrub, drier coniferous forests in terms of distribution. It can be a little bit higher up. But the key feature here is look at the size of that spur. So here's your lip here, distinctly longer than the lip. What's tricky is that, you know, you'll read about that and, oh, look at the spur, but when they're all clustered up like this, you just see a bunch of tangle, and it's really hard without dissecting these flowers and isolating them to see those differences. White flower rain orchid. I would have called this one Sparsiflora. It has very sparse flowers, as you can see. They're also kind of weeping is one thing I see. They always kind of hang down, much more limited range, mostly coastal. These things are chaparrals, a lot of the chaparral, the coastal chaparral stuff, but generally very near the coast. Once you get inland, you're not going to see these things. Little known about pollination, but going back to our previous species, I mean, look at the length of the spur here. I mean, can anybody see the spur? I've tried to find them. So when you see that spur hanging down, it's not this guy. The spur is just this little nub back here. So very small, pretty distinct, sparse floras, white, clearly not confused with a bog candle. Okay, Michael's rain orchid. This is one that's actually quite rare. It's a California endemic. I don't necessarily know if I buy this one. Platanthera michaelii. The key feature here is this triangular lip. Notice how much wider and obtuse it is here. It's got that green yellow color. Again, coastal scrub, some coastal coniferous forests. I've never seen this thing, and I kind of wondered why. Well, this record here is from 1912. That's the only record I found in any herbarium. So it's on our list. If you find this, you call me and I will personally drive you to the site with a cameraman. Because I hate to say it, I think this is probably gone. And it's quite rare farther south where it does exist. So this is one of those species of concern. But that triangular lip, if you do see it, is a dead giveaway. Yellow-green color. But again, yellow-green doesn't tell you too much. Platanthera sparsiflora. Remember we saw that other sparse flowered one? Well, now we have another one, and the flowers look actually a lot more dense than the other one. So bad naming. Yellow-green flowers. Again, you need a hand lens. All the way from Mexico up to Washington, wooded areas, wet sites, kind of these seeps. Most orchids, if you see flowing cool water, they're great. Formerly piperia. You can find these even in roadside ditches in some places, but the key here is the length of that lip, and then look at the twists of the lateral sepals and compare it to the erect lateral petals and the dorsal sepal. So you basically have the lateral petals and the sepal forming a hood over the top, and then you have your lateral sepals down below twisted behind you. Easy, right? No problem. Yellow-green flower. They also have a fairly big column, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But small moths pollinate these things as far as we know. This one I really love. This is the slender bog orchid, which again, one of those common names that I can't stand, because the distinguishing feature of this thing is this long bulbous spur. So remember the other one that was like long and, kind of almost sword-like? Well, this thing that kind of robust gets the name stricta, sorry, but Platanthera stricta, but the slender bog orchid is the common name. And it's basically because the flowers are very compressed against the inflorescence. So when you see it in profile, overall, it looks slender. Botanists get creative sometimes, I think. But again, another West Coast thing, you look at the range overlap. I mean, it gets all the way out in the Aleutians, but you can find any of these things pretty much in similar habitats. But the club-like spur is the key feature of these guys. And this thing is a generalist, pollinated by bees, mosquitoes, any of that stuff. There is some confusion. I'll talk briefly about it, but this may have been misidentified as Hyperborea, which is more widespread.
We might be getting saturated.
Okay, we're at the end. I appreciate that. Thank you. Last one, or second to last one? Last one. Platanthera toscanus. This one is another one I think was misidentified. There is one record of this from 1927 in Humboldt County. This is known as a Western thing, much drier, higher elevation things. The record from Humboldt County was in a sphagnum bog. I don't buy that. I mentioned the Hyperborea. There's a lot of cross-listing and all that taxonomic differentiation. I think this is maybe a false one. And I believe this is the last one. We've got Platanthera transversa, and this one's an easy one. Again, you can find it out here, but look at this. Transverse, the spur sticks basically perpendicular to the stem. So if you see that thing with that crossing over thing, and it's kind of got a flat appearance with these green markings. Coniferous woodlands. This one I know is at the dunes as well. I've seen this right next to elegans. One more. Last sentence. I told you Platanthera drives me nuts too. Again, small yellow flowers, much more inland, yellow green. The key thing here is these. You can see them here. It's kind of got these sickle-shaped sepals. As I told you, this has caused me to practice. These things are tough and they keep changing. Okay, so that is the Humboldt orchids, 3 subfamilies, 25 species. We've gone over them. I'm going to test you guys at the end here, but I can't leave you without a couple more words. As I mentioned, these are important indicators and targets for conservation. A lot of these things, even though they're not listed, they're not federally endangered, they're not even on California Endangered Species Act, they are being targeted worldwide. Something this showy never makes me comfortable. And there have been known population declines, not only here, but throughout the state. So I am very concerned about these things, state listed ones, even the common ones. This is like passenger pigeons. Well, we see them everywhere, no problem. I see people digging them up in national parks. It's not good. They might make it, but not good. No bueno. And this is why, again, I'll revisit that slide that I showed at the beginning. 50% of every orchid that we've evaluated with the IUCN Orchid Conservation Group is either extinct, critically endangered, vulnerable, even this little slice of near threat. But we're well over 50% that are in problems of some manner. That bothers me. So what I do with IUCN, with the teams I work globally, as part of the conservation committee. We do field work. We work with local partners, park rangers, local scientists to document, identify orchids. Again, around the world, we have people everywhere working on this. We collect seeds. I think I showed you guys have the little seed. We have hundreds of jars of these that we cryopreserve, that we save for perpetuity, but also to isolate in the lab and do micropropagation trials. We also harvest roots, as I mentioned about the mycorrhizal, thank you, the mycorrhizal fungi. We culture those and we put those into mycorrhizal fungi banks, and we're able to propagate them. This is one of my favorite collaborators, Dr. Larry Zettler and I. This is in a greenhouse in Washington, D.C. with one of our orchids from Palau that we were the first to germinate and propagate. We're now prepared to start reintroducing these things into reforest areas in Palau. So this is our park rangers here actually planting trees in disturbed areas. We're raising orchids so that when those trees start to mature, we can reintroduce those communities as well. And then lastly, but not leastly, none of this is possible without the buy-in from local stakeholders and community members. And so as part of our the Smithsonian North American Orchid Conservation Association, we do this little fun art project, which my boss actually started. I've been involved in 1 or 2 models, but we work to do outreach programs. And so we've developed these orchidgami models, which are punch out, cut out little native orchid flowers that you can fold up that are literally anatomically and scientifically correct. And there's information on each species. Some of these, like the fairy slipper, is in here. And so we use these with school groups at museums, retirement communities, anybody that we want to get involved in a craft program and tell them a little bit about orchids. So we sell these, they're $20. If anybody's interested, I brought 5. You can get them elsewhere. But it goes to promote orchid conservation at the Smithsonian program. So again, really focus on holistic approaches. And with that, I'll take any questions that you guys might have. Sorry if it took so long. We got a little bit of a late start. So it's not entirely my fault.
Too many months. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you guys. Appreciate it. Orchids of California.
The question there.
Question, yes, sir.
Hear anything about seed capsules? Do these things just flower and then die back to rarely produce seed capsules, or are you saying that they happen so quickly that you just
It's highly variable. That's a very deep question. Some of these things can self. So they will flower and every single flower will produce a capsule, whether it's pollinated or not. Some will actually develop that way. So in other words, they're waiting for a pollinator, and as they age, the column will actually curl over onto itself to self-pollinate. It's programmed to do so. Others will never set fruit unless they have a pollinator. The ephemeral ones, again, great question. I was thinking Calypso, I've always wanted to work with it. I'm thinking, great, here are the flowers. I saw the ovaries starting to swell. I'm thinking these guys are ready. I'll come back in a week or a month, or I'm sorry, 3 weeks or a month. Should be nice and right. Gone. So
I can
varies.
tell you, in the Lanphier Dunes, you can find the Calypso capsules empty in August.
oh yeah, yeah.
So if something hasn't eaten them, they do hang around.
And that's another thing. Some of them will enlarge and mature, but not have been pollinated. I don't know how many times I've been in the field, come back overseas. Oh, I've got this gorgeous fruit. I'm drying it out, dissect that thing open, bare naked inside. There's nothing in there. Big fat fruit. No pollination, but it'll still enlarge. So yeah, yes and no to all. I mean, it's really a matter of practice. You got to get out there and know your species and really time it. Yeah, so it can be tricky. And that's one thing, most of my work has been in the tropics. So I just go back next week. Here, great, we missed it. See you next March. You know, it's you got a year of waiting to try and figure it out. So yeah, it's challenging. But yeah, I've seen them all. You know, again, Goodyear, you go out there, you can just see the spent inflorescences, and I've seen them in November, December, and I'll flick it with my finger and it's like, oh, there's still seed in there. It's totally brown, completely open, but there's a little bit hanging on, and which ecologically makes sense, because if you can release a lot of seeds, but not all of them, and every time something brushes into you, you send out a few more, you're more likely to catch that window of water or sun that you need. So, yeah, and that's another advantage of having 10,000 seeds in something that big. Yeah, question, yeah.
So are they providing nectar?
Yes and no. Some do. The vast majority don't. Orchids are known as cheaters. They spend a lot of time on attracting things and giving them nothing. So yeah, they'll spend time on fragrance. It's like, look, I smell great. And they'll dig in there. There's nothing in there. Great. Thanks for the pollination. See you later.
Because they got rid of their and it's the else. So they're just basically trapped.
Yep. And a lot of times you'll see orchids near flowers that look somewhat similar. So they'll attract pollinators that get duped by mimicking something else. Yeah. One more question, yeah?
Do you have any hopes or plans to incorporate some of our local orchid species into the botanical garden?
I would love to. I have high hopes. I would love to, yeah.
But you can't do.
Not at the moment. Not at the moment, yeah. We'll get permits and we'll go from there, but yeah, it requires a lot of work and a lot of study. You know, you need time to explore these things and really do the science. Yeah.
It is possible to do.
It is, yes. And interestingly, it's a little bit easier here. It's weird for all of California regulations. You don't really need a plant collection permit from the state of California unless it's listed. Where it gets tricky is if you're going to collect on Forest Service land or BLM land or whatever the agency might be, they have their own set of regulations, and you do need to get permits from that. But even on private land, I would never go collecting without talking to somebody and getting some kind of permission. The only time I collect without true permission is when I pull over on the highway and see something in a roadside ditch. Then it's like, ooh, I'll collect some seed from that. You know, that's okay, and it's legal, provided it's not listed. But it's not usually common. If you're finding cool orchids, you're usually on something that's protected or something of that nature. But yeah, it's worth it. I mean, it's definitely the way to do it. So,
Okay, let's thank Ben.
all right, thank you guys.
And I'm sure he'd love to talk more if you want to.
And I do have the videos here if anybody wants to see a 10-second video of some cool stuff. Yeah, if somebody sends it to me. It's just an attachment of a video I have, like a photo. So yeah, totally. I think that can go. Hey, good. How are you?
I'm working on.
Oh, all right.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
10 models. Is it 10 models?
I don't know.
20 models. I was gonna say, I think it's like a monkey. Yeah, they're super fun.
That's so cool.
I can also give you some advice on them.
Yes,
The instructions, I think.
So there was some.
But there are dotted lines that represent like a hill fold. Dash lines that represent a valley fold. Look at the picture of the back of the model. See the diagram. Part of the way ABCD and like 3 points. It's like one in yellow, one in the. At first, it's a little bit confusing.